Ah, bonjour tout le monde, je suis Justin Massie, je suis professeur de sciences politiques et co-directeur du réseau d'analyse stratégique. And I'm very happy to welcome with us today John Blaxland, who's the director of the ANU North America Liaison Office and professor of international security and intelligence studies in the Strategic and Defense Studies Center, Cora Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. You're a former Australian military intelligence officer, a trusted and highly regarded historian who has authored or co-authored over a dozen broad-ranging works on international military security and intelligence affairs. And it's really a pleasure to have you, John, on this topic of making sense of the poly crisis. I think we all need to make sense of all of these crazy times we're living in, I think, and I'm really happy you're here with us this afternoon. Welcome to everybody online and in person. It's going to be this event in English, but once it's available online, we'll have the subtitles in French for those who would prefer to do this that way. So we'll start with the presentation of yours, which I'll comment afterwards, and then we can open for questions online or in person.
Merveilleux. Merci, Justin, pour l'occasion de venir à l'Université de Québec à Montréal. C'est la première fois que j'avais venu. C'est un grand honneur pour moi à venir parler avec vous aujourd'hui.
This is great because you said more French than Michel Brousseau, the former CEO of Air Canada. So there may be an opening for you today.
Incroyable. Je sais que c'est un peu difficile à comprendre ce que je dis parce que mon accent, c'est plus étrange. Un Australien parler en français avec un accent espagnol, je sais que c'est meilleur si je continue en anglais. S'il vous plaît, je vais continuer en anglais. Merci. Thank you, Justin. So I'm trying to make sense of the polycrisis. And what do we mean by that? I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is my favorite map, centered on Darwin in Australia, spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia and of the Indo-Pacific and of what the former Indonesian president Joko Widodo described as the maritime fulcrum that space Indonesia and Australia occupy. So what I did was a SWOT analysis, a strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, a study on Australia. And then so it's in that space. This is my background noise, publications I've written over the years that inform this presentation today, amongst others. But essentially, when I did the SWOT, I showed it to my wife, who's here, and I said, so what? And she said, so what? Which I thought was a bit cruel, but fair. And I needed to dig deeper to think about the so what. And the implication was this Venn diagram, which is an overlap of looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, the great power competition, and all of that accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. And in the middle is a no man's land, which nobody owns, no academic discipline, no institution, no jurisdiction. So it's what I call, the other way of describing it is a great disruption, or everything, everywhere, all at once, to riff off the title of that recent movie. But it's been complicated by what's happened in what Walter Russell Mead has called the Great Disruption. New technologies, industries, ideas, institutions facing upheaval, international politics can't be walled off, and we need to brace for turmoil. And what does that turmoil look like? Part of it is the return of Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, which is understandable, I think, in terms of 5 factors. One is the economic imbalance that saw China rise and the Rust Belt emerge. 2 is the global defense overreach with the multi-trillion-dollar wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who knows how much the one in Iran is going to cost. The illiberal reaction to the so-called woke agenda that Stephen Hahn wrote about in his book, Liberal America, and is captured in this idea of Christian nationalism. 4th one is the idea of defending borders against mass migration. That was blamed on Joe Biden, but obviously is a much broader issue. And then there's distrust of big government that goes back to the lure of conspiracies, the global financial crisis, bank bailout by the Obama administration, and this desire to drain the swamp. Something has got it, some outside of the mold has to break it. And that's what I think goes a long way to explain it. And of course, the Epstein files are reinforcing this sense of distrust. And Project 2025, which was denied in 2024, is coming alive and well in 2026. And so what we're seeing, I would say, is a transactional retreat from ideational leadership. We're seeing talks of annexation, a disbandment, of abandonment, and of distancing, and of unusual friendships. And in this space, we have what I call the rules-based international order, which many people like to decry, but I say it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire. Not holy, not Roman, not an empire, but it nonetheless was of enduring significance. Same with the rules-based order. We still ship things, we still conduct transactions, we still fly airlines internationally, we still have agreements. So yes, it's rocky, but it's not dissolved. Meanwhile, we're seeing beautiful tariffs apparently emerging, and this is something that is rocking the world. And when I grew up, I'd heard about the Smoot-Hawley Act, right? The Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, following the stock market crash in New York of 1929, which then consolidated the Great Depression, which there was a precursor to World War II. So the lesson was, don't do Smoot-Hawley, right? I thought, right? Didn't we all think that, right? And of course, that's not what's happening in the US today. And meanwhile, when there's supply and demand, there's ebbs and flows, and there's this desire to place tariffs on anything that has an advantageous relationship with the United States at the moment. But like with Australian beef, there's good years and there's bad years. You know, we have droughts and we have floods. America has droughts and floods. So at the moment, we're going through a bit of a peak in sales of beef. But as you can see, it's temporary, right? So you can't extrapolate from 1 year's statistics on how things are going. This is why we like to get away from tariffs. We think it's good. But then there's a debate, well, okay, are we long on America? Those who sell America may find themselves regretting it. This article in The Spectator has argued, and I think there's a point there. But there is a real sense that Trump is aiming to unbind the executive from the constraints imposed by the other branches of government. And of course, the left railed against globalism, hoping for a socialist global nirvana. And instead, we've got Jacksonian nationalism, disinclined to care about international institutions, but it's not isolationism. People thought he might have been isolationist at first. That's clearly not the case, but he's mercantilist and he's unilateralist. And it's generating global backlash. And this is manifested in Australia in this polling done by the Lowy Institute, which rates Trump up with Xi on the same level as Xi, which is extraordinary. That is unimaginable in the past. So we're seeing talk, even Time magazine, for instance, of the dark enlightenment of this, which speaks to this, the republic of lies, of a deep need to get rid of the state and do something different, replacing democracy with a government to be run like a CEO, like a corporation, and then there's the talk about Yalta 2.0, this idea of multipolarity, of carving the world up. And yet, as Tom Friedman points out, we're still very interdependent. And of course, if you're sitting in a country like Poland, which I gave a talk similar to this recently, there was like sucking of teeth. Why? Because if you are Yalta 1.0, you got stuck behind the Iron Curtain, right? No one wants to repeat that. And of course, where are the borders? Are they in Iran? Are they in Ukraine? Are they in Gaza? Who knows? It's not articulated, right? And then we see Colby talking about a call for what is effectively NATO 3.0. You Europeans, you worry about NATO, you worry about Russia. We've got other fish to fry. And then we've got globalization. We've got this idea of the globalization not having worked for America, especially, even though it's been very beneficial for much of the world. This idea that Beijing's foot dragging, its theft of intellectual property, and its preferences for domestic producers, there's led this thinking by David Lynch and others to say the gamble didn't work. We need to revisit. That's why we need tariffs, right? So there is a sense of rationality to it, if not one we would necessarily agree on. And then there's this issue of commercial diplomacy and choke points and the dollar dominance and the question about using that as a tool, as a weapon, if you like, and that's been done for the last couple of decades. And there's a question there about how long this can continue. How long will the yuan stay second fiddle? How long will other countries play along? In this space is this authoritarian stack, the tech billionaires, the tech bros, if you like, building this, what's been described by Francesca Bria as a post-democratic America. And this idea of patriotic tech, the tech bros who are doing this for the Trumpian version of the United States that's faster ideological and fully privatized. And then there's obviously linked to this issue is the question of, well, how dominant will the US dollar continue to be, given all this turbulence, given this pressure on the multipolarity? What's going to happen? Well, we're seeing from Elbridge Colby and Michael Green this idea that the United States remains very interested in China, in containing and addressing China. The strategy of denial by more than Providence articulate this vision of America remaining engaged in East Asia in a way that counters the emergence of Chinese power. That's been reinforced by Hegseth at the Shangri-La dialogue last year, talking about Indo-Pacific remaining a priority. But obviously, it's not just the Western Hemisphere, but Iran is taking all the news space at the moment. But there is clearly a priority elsewhere as well. The national security strategy of last year talked about going back to the Americas, America first, redefining global threats and emphasizing homeland defense, although you wouldn't know it from the news of the last month over the war in Iran. But this gets to this point about the national security strategy. Perhaps what we're seeing is a consolidation, trading near-term risk for long-term gain. This is the idea that maybe there's a grander theory behind this, that it's not chaos, but it's 3D chess. Now there's a cause for considerable skepticism about that idea. The National Defense Strategy, which came out in January, reinforced this idea of defending the homeland, deterring China, increasing burden sharing, and supercharging the industrial base, with, of course, the most mentions of President Trump and China. And very few, Iran gets a few mentions, Russia gets a few, Canada and Australia, you guys feature 3 times, not as 51st. Australia doesn't even rate a mention.
You prefer 0, though.
You prefer 0. Yes, I can appreciate that. Right. And there was this talk of, Tom Friedman talked about me first politics, and Stephen Walt about the predatory hegemon. These are Americans writing about their own country. This isn't some left-wing, loopy European anti-American diatribe. These are American patriots who are deeply worried about what's happening in their country. Secretary Rubio recently going to the Munich Security Conference, talking about policy choices that have weakened the West, and talking about remedy being sovereignty, resilience, and strength. And I think there is certain resonance to that. And that certainly, his speech resonated with many people who were at that speech, in stark contrast to the J.D. Vance speech of a year earlier. And so it does show that alliances do remain central. And even this last week with President Trump's calls for allies to play in the Strait of Hormuz resolution suggests that there's a hot and cold recognition of the importance of allies. Alexander Stubb, this fantastic book, The Triangle of Power, I commend it to you, talks about the global East, the global South, and the global West. Multipolarity, multilateralism, and the call for values-based realism. Although since he came out with this at the Munich Security Conference, he started talking about a quadrangle of power. What does he mean? Well, he's taken out the US and called it the global North by inference. Right? So he's saying basically the West is now kind of bifurcated from the rest of from the USA, which is a chilling thought, But this is only a few months old. This book has only come out a few months ago, and he's already rejigging it. So the question then is, are we seeing the sorcerer or the sorcerer's apprentice? Is there some clever master plan, or is this chaos unfolding by someone who really doesn't know what they're doing? And this is a riffing off Goethe here, and this idea of the master and his wayward apprentice. Is Trump? Which one is he? And there are arguments on the right of politics that he is masterful and clever, and making Europe pay 5% of GDP on defense, and disarming Iran, and bringing it so that America can next focus on China. That's the theory. Is it valid? Who knows? In Australia, there is a real sense that America is kind of abandoning the world. And the essays by my colleague Hugh White, who wrote this book, Hard New World, Our Post-American Future, and Emma Shortis, who's written After America, Australia and the New World Order. I don't think we're there yet. I think these make great headlines, but they do raise a lot of questions, and they do point to a trend of us needing to think differently about a partnership that we have taken for granted, much like has been the case in Canada. So I think there's been a need to rethink international relations writ large, okay? And here I'm talking about, the Fukuyama moment is over. We're no longer singing Kumbaya and holding hands, okay? So we need to go back to the international relations drawing board, I would contend. That includes thinking about Amitav Acharya's work, this Indian scholar who works at the American University, who says the West has never had a monopoly on order and its decline could be a positive thing. I hope you're right, Amitav. I really do. I'm just not sure that it is, right? And it's a big gamble. It's a hope, right? And I would say we need to actually go back to first principles. And for me, going back to first principles is Thucydides, for whom there are 3 words to describe the causes of war: fear, honor, and interests. And it's a compelling thesis which I've extrapolated into the Australian South Pacific context in that piece for the Melbourne Asian Review. Also, Mackinder and Spikeman are talking about the heartland, the rimland, the consequential significance of Eurasia and dominance of Eurasia, and the idea of the US fighting for global hegemony, Russia struggling for independence and relevance, and China's plan to establish trade routes between East and West. I would contend also, if you're sitting in Kiev or in Tehran or in Gaza, then you're actually thinking more about not so much Maslow's top hierarchy, but the lower ones. Am I going to survive the night? Am I going to live through the experience, right? And then, of course, Morgenthau and his Magisterial Politics Among Nations, written at the start of the Cold War, talking about 9 elements of national power, which for decades was the go-to reference. Morgenthau is the most cited scholar out there in international relations, but after 89, he went off the boil, right? People stopped quoting him, stopped referring to him. I would contend he's back in center stage. Okay. Then there's Mahan and the influence of sea power. This provides insights into the interplay between geography, economics, and military might. And of course, the People's Liberation Army Navy of China has it as almost as a Bible for military use of sea power, right? A lasting impact, not just on naval war colleges around the West, but clearly in China as well. And I would contend when we're thinking about the Chinese and Western way of thinking, and I'm a former a lecturer at our staff college in Australia, we all gravitate to Karl von Clausewitz, the dead Prussian, who talked about the continuation of politics by other means and talked about the tension between theory and the chaotic reality of warfare. I would contend, we give a bit of lip service to Sun Tzu, but I would say his work is actually more consequential today than ever, particularly because of its influence on Chinese thinking, right? And he argued the highest form of victory is achieved without fighting, and for us in the West, the metaphor we gravitate towards is the game of chess. And in chess, you're about removing your adversary from the board, right? And checkmating the king. In Go, which I think is a better metaphor for the circumstance we face today, it isn't that, it's something else. It's envelopment and co-option. It's about bringing them into your camp, not removing them. That is a completely different way of thinking. And we have not got our heads around what that means. Kautilya's Arthashastra is also significant. India's great work on describing diplomacy as a subtle act of war. This is throwing Clausewitz on his head, right? And perhaps Clausewitz got it from Kautilya, I'm not sure. But rather than seeing war as a continuation of politics by the means, India is seeing it the other way around, which goes a long way to, I think, to explain India's outlook on the world as well. In my own university, we've got scholars like Evelyn Goh talking about the struggle for order and the East Asian hierarchy, which is arguably up for contention as to who's up which rung of the ladder. And Leszek Brzezinski, my colleague there as well, talking about weakening US resolve, confirming the view that China displaced the United States. But he makes the point, China is facing enormous headwinds demographically, economically, and of course, facing significant overconfidence that's complicating its appeal, particularly to neighbors in Southeast Asia and beyond. So as we think about this spectrum of challenges, I've been trying to think about the work of my colleague, Anthea Roberts, who came up with this risk-reward resilience framework. And to me, it's a very compelling model to think about how do we holistically think through the implications of the complexity we face today. What do we do about risk? What do we do to reward? And how do we become more resilient? How do we bolster that? How do we manage the risk, grapple with the prospects for reward and resilience? So what are other countries doing, or what particularly China? And when you think about this, I would contend it's really useful to think of it as an intelligence analyst, and I'm a former military intelligence analyst. And what we do is we think about threat, capability, and we talk about intent and capability. Capability, what can they do? What kit do they have? What is the range? How well practiced are they using it? How proficient are they? And then the question is intent. What are they publicly declaring they'll do? And what are they saying behind closed doors that they're not telling us because they're secretly planning to employ that capability in certain manners? These are questions that are alive and well today as the world becomes more opaque, particularly with the emergence of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa coalition, and of course the CRINCS, the China, Russia, India, North Korea. Iran, North Korea, a partnership, which the sorcerer versus the apprentice hypothesis would say the hitting on Iran today is all about pulling apart the CRINCS. Now, whether it's going to come to fruition is anybody's guess at the moment. But when we think about nuclear armed powers, gross GDP, and of course, aircraft carriers, Australia is pretty close to being in the center. It's interesting. Canada is probably going to, this diagram is now a couple of years old. Canada is going to shift from being in the top right space, it's part of the Venn, into perhaps closer into where Australia is located. And there's good cause for that. But when we think about China, when we think about China's growth and its military spending, the red circle there on the left, the hard red is the declared spending. The outer ring of red is what pundits are saying is probably the more realistic spending of Chinese defense. But even if you only go with the declared spending, it is outpacing the rest of Asia by a country mile, right? And of course, in this space, we're seeing Chinese manufacturing going ballistic in the yellow there compared to America. And on the right, you see a map of Chinese trade dominance in 2001 when it joined the World Trade Organization versus 2024, a quarter of a century later, and you see it's dominating global trade. Now, there are limits to this comparison, but it's useful to make. Britain and the British Empire, with the first industrial revolution, right? It needed raw materials, it needed markets, it needed security for the raw materials and markets. It then needed governance for the raw materials, security, and markets. That happened over 250 years. China has done that in 1/10 the time. Now, it's not the same. It doesn't govern in the same way, but what will happen in the next 25 or 50 years? I would contend there are already strong signs of wanting to play that security and governance over their economic interests, over mines in Africa and elsewhere that are sobering to think of. This is 25 years in, folks. What does the next 25 or 50 year look like? Well, part of it's going to be driven by demographics and the imploding of Chinese and Western and other countries' demographics. The only exception, of course, is Africa. They're the only ones who are growing in any measurable way. Realistically, there are a couple of exceptions, Papua New Guinea being one of them. But essentially, the rest of the West and everyone else, we're on a pretty bad trajectory. It's not a sustainable one. We actually have not thought this through, what this means to depopulate. Meanwhile, the global race is on for data centers. And at the moment, the United States is clearly winning that one. And partly because they've got the water, they've got the energy with nuclear power, and they've got the Mississippi Basin that they can draw upon. But China is trying to dominate the physical AI future, robotics, the kit, the hardware, and Chinese robots are coming, and they're coming in droves or in waves of droves. And what the question is, what will China dominate next? You know, there's low-cost innovation washing around the world. The Iranian drones are technologically fed by China's innovation as well. And then there's this sense of, well, what will China do? Well, of course, and Ketian Zhang has argued this very well, I think, in his book, China's Gambit, that for them, the core issues are Taiwan and Tibet. Touch them and we'll go ballistic. But short of that, they'll balance the reputational benefit against the economic and geopolitical costs. And there are significant costs for them. Meanwhile, Russia is becoming this, you know, there's a number of books out there. I've got a couple of them here for you, a couple of them that speak to the problem. I just need to put this on silent. Sorry. My favorite one is the chauvinist threat in the top bottom right there. Sabrina Fisher, who talks about Russia as a geopolitical wife beater. I think that's such a wonderful metaphor for the ugliness of Russia's behavior. You know. Meanwhile, we've got the prospects of what my colleague Brendan Taylor described as the four flashpoints: Korea, East China Sea, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, the South China Sea, and of course the Taiwan scenario. The Taiwan one is the one that gets all the news. But when we think about technology in this space, it's very interesting to think China just did this recently, massed boat drones off between China and Japan. This is apparently designed to spoof radars, to basically shield a potential invading force from Japanese and Western radars that would detect and be able to respond to a wave of, you know, assaulters from mainland China to Taiwan. But when we think about Taiwan, it's useful to reflect on the Korean experience. And we've all, Korea, Australia, and Canada fought in the Korean War alongside. But you know, China, I would contend, doesn't want to see a repeat of the Korean War. It cost millions of lives, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, including Mao Zedong's son. No self-respecting Chinese leader wants to see that happen again, right? And see a UN command established against you. So how do you do that? You avoid it by squeezing, not seizing. But this idea of squeezing Taiwan, I think, is very much what we're seeing happen. And as Kevin Rudd's argued in his book, The Avoidable War, there is a prospect for managed strategic competition. And as my colleague Ian Henry's argued, you know, it's not a lay down misère. The consequences of escalation and of abandonment, they're not set in stone, okay? But Kevin Rudd's book on Xi Jinping, I commend it to you. It's really very good. He basically says, in a nutshell, Xi is a Marxist-Leninist nationalist. What on earth does that mean, John? It means he believes in communism. Get out of here. Who does that these days? Xi does. He's a Leninist, so he believes in the party control of the state, with him in charge of the party. And he's a nationalist, so he's all about revenge for the century of humiliation. And you guys have had it coming. That's us, right? China says it's ready for war, does a circumnavigation of Australia, conducting a gunnery exercise off the coast of Sydney, between Sydney and Auckland, interrupting flight paths. Technically legal, thing to see here, folks, move along, all within that grey zone. The idea of actually really intimidating but not actually doing something illegal. Meanwhile, it's been signing agreements, security pacts with Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Tonga, and Cook Islands, and more. The red circles. But what Americans tend to forget is that their presence in the Pacific is huge. Americans don't think about the Pacific very much, but they've got an enormous territory in the Pacific, right up against the Philippines and Indonesia, pictured there with Palau, let alone all the blue circles. And I would contend in this piece we're seeing the reverse opium war that going on, and it's going on gangbusters with industrial scale manufacturing and shipping of illegal drugs through the Pacific, across the Pacific, and into Australia's territory. Meanwhile, when we think about that space on the corner of the Eurasian landmass, we don't tend to think very much about Southeast Asia, or we don't aggregate it. But I would contend when you think about this, this is a proto-great power. It's been very busy doing a lot of hedging. People talk about balancing, bandwagoning and hedging. Southeast Asia has been doing hedging, right? And as Hunter Marston's argued, it's blunting, it's broadening, boosting, and binding. It's a very compelling thesis on what the ASEANis are doing. They don't want to have to bank on one side or the other. They want to have their cake and eat it. But it's getting more problematic as time goes by. Meanwhile, we've got a festering civil war in Myanmar that nobody seems to give a damn about. And I use that word advisedly because these poor people are damned, right? Meanwhile, we've got a war between Cambodia and Thailand, and it's not about China. What is it about? Well, it's going back in history, and there's lots of national pride about the border and who owns the temple on the border, on the escarpment, and whether it's a Khmer temple or a Thai temple. But really, you've got to follow the money, ladies and gentlemen, because what it comes down to is whose border demarcation you believe. The French drawn one from 1907 or the American drawn one from 1945, both following the Franco-Siam Agreement. But the Franco version of it actually took a few liberties and took a bit of the northern side of the watershed, which for what is now Cambodia. But when you think about it, the real point of view, it's about the oil and gas. Do you take the American line or the French line? Because in there is estimates of up to $800 billion worth of oil and gas. So follow the money, ladies and gentlemen. And when you think about following the money, when you think about what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, 20% of oil goes through there, but overwhelming 70% of Chinese and East Asian trade goes through the Malacca Strait. The Malacca dilemma is incredibly consequential. It is what is driving a desire for a pipeline through Myanmar from Kunming down to Chakpu in the Bay of Bengal. It's driving a desire for a cutting of a canal through the Kra Isthmus in southern Thailand. And I would contend it goes a long way to explain why the Belt and Road Initiative had to be built, to mitigate the risks of being cut off like the Japanese were in the Malacca Strait in World War II. From a submarine base in Perth here that was able to interdict all of the Japanese ships. So there's a Thai-Burma railway built from Thailand to Burma by prisoners of war. Many of them were Australians. Why? Because Japan could not get its ships up the Malacca Strait. Why? Because there are 170 Allied submarines operating out of Perth. Wow. Most people have no idea about that. But that space, ASEAN, is consequential, economically consequential, politically consequential. Now, China's trying to go around the other way, but it can only do that a couple of months of the year, and it really needs the Malacca Strait. Meanwhile, we don't tend to think very much about Antarctica. You guys think about the Arctic. I would contend there are strong parallels with Australia's circumstances. There's geopolitical competition going gangbusters here. Russia, China, Norway, Australia, Britain, France, Argentina, Chile, these are all claimants of Antarctica. Many of them are the same claimants of territory in the Arctic. So there are some parallels there. I think Australia and Canada can work more closely on. War in the Ukraine, I don't need to bore you on this. We know it's going on. I'm hoping it will end a bit like the Korean War ended, with a demilitarized zone. But it is clearly, as Robin Laird's argued, the furnace of the new global order. We're seeing exposing the collapse of the post-1991 assumptions, this crystallizing an authoritarian axis, the CRINX, if you like, and this being a laboratory for warfare. And we're seeing it manifesting with the Ukrainians now exporting their technology to Gulf states to try and catch up, because America hasn't, Australia hasn't, Canada hasn't, the rest of the Europe, NATO and others, we haven't caught up. We're playing catch up. And then there's, of course, the toxic effects of the war in Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, and Iran, and the so-called Board of Peace, which I don't know if it's gone to ground or not. I haven't heard from it released recently. And of course, the war in Iran that's festering has been going for a month now. Are we on the edge of World War III? I don't know. I don't think so. And Australia is playing in this space. We've got an airborne early warning and control aircraft contributing in the United Arab Emirates, but of course it's also feeding. It's integrated with the US system. So we don't advertise that fact because we're not all that thrilled on what the Americans have been doing lately. And politically, it doesn't sell in Australia to advertise that fact. But that's an integrated platform. So there's no question you can't do that. So, but this gets to this question: the sorcerer or the apprentice. Is this part of a greater game? Is this some cunning plan? You know, in a sense, or not? And I'm hoping it is, but you know, there's so many indicators that it's not. That's the thing. Now, I want to shift to the other part of the Venn diagram, the fourth industrial revolution. And the four industrial revolutions that Jeffrey Ding outlines here in the technology and the rise of great powers. It's really interesting to think about. Britain dominated the first one, America the second one. Japan nearly came out top of the third one with the computers in the 1990s, but they lost their mojo. And then, of course, this last one, the artificial intelligence one, where the game is still on. Is it China or is it the United States? And of course, when you think about this, the breakneck pace of this book by Dan Wang speaks to this problem. China as an engineering state facing off against America's loyalty society. So, for instance, China builds railways, fast-speed trains across the country. California can't build one between LA and San Francisco. It's been 25 years in the making. Still not there. It's extraordinary, right? Extraordinary, this loyalty society. But of course, the cyberspace, this is part of the fourth industrial revolution. This AI is happening in the cyber world. What is the cyber world, please? Somebody tell me. Well, it's multidimensional, obviously. It's hardware. It's physical, it's virtual, it's cognitive, or it's, as I like to say, it's hardware, software, and the wetware, right? The 15 centimeters between our ears, the cognitive space. It's as much the cyber domain as anything else in that space. But of course, 95% of it is actually undersea cables. Most of the internet traffic is happening at light speed undersea. And of course, what happened at the start of the First and Second World War? Snip, snip, snip. Cables got cut. We are more dependent and more vulnerable now than we have ever been. And it's extraordinary. Then we've got space and saying, oh, you can do it on space. Well, you can do some of it in space, but there needs to be a massive ramp up. 95% of internet traffic is via the sea, right? Via the cables. But we're seeing more and more in this low Earth orbit, mid-Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, the space. I was just at a conference at Purdue last week talking about this. It is getting crowded. It is nonetheless, they consider it still manageable. The growth trajectory is manageable. We can probably host a couple of million satellites in low Earth to mid-Earth orbit in the coming years. They were reasonably optimistic. That's my one-line takeaway from that conference, actually. But it's very interesting. Yuval Harari's book on AI as potentially more momentous than the invention of the telegraph. This is kind of really cooking things, right? Systems might collapse, he argues, right? And AIs are more than capable of promoting distorted worldviews. So we're relying more and more on them, but they could actually cook us. They could actually become our enemy. And this is the issue about humans in the loop, right? And in Harari's book on Nexus, he talks about the need for a human in the loop, because you don't want to get to the point where this non-conscious, powerful alien intelligence could have potentially extinguished human dominion, right? This is actually not inconceivable. And the book makes a compelling argument of that. You want a human in the loop. So it's very interesting to see the anthropic pushback from the Pentagon, where Pete Hegseth is saying, I don't want a human in the loop. I want this fully automated. And I'm thinking, well, good on you, Darius. We want guardrails. We need guardrails, right? We need more people like Darius to actually stand up for guardrails. Because if you're doing this purely for the profit motive, without actually considering the human condition, we've got a problem, all right? And this gets to another aspect of the problem, which Anthea Roberts writes about in her book, Six Faces of Globalization, that we're all in our echo chambers, right? We're all on our devices. We're all getting algorithmic reinforcement of our own worldview that is just seeing us becoming more and more polarized. Everyone else is bad. Only I'm good, right? Only my view of the world is valid. The rest of them can go to hell, right? And literally, this is the kind of rhetoric we're hearing from people today about the other, right? So we've got this six-dimensional problem: air, sea, land, space, cyber, and cognitive, right? And it's got all of those domains I talked about. But in this case, space, I think we're facing what I would call unrestricted competition. Now, this riffs off this book by a couple of Chinese colonels in the late 1990s called Unrestricted Warfare, which at the time seemed over the top. Really, John? Warfare? Come on. Psychological, media, legal, and economic? No. Take the word warfare out, put the word competition in, click, 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 click. OMG. Look at that. It's going on gangbusters, right? This is the world we're living in. Unrestricted competition. But not all competition's bad, right? Some of it's darn good. You know, sporting competition is terrific. The competition between the Soviets and the Americans to put a man on the moon? Well, would Neil Armstrong have got there in April 1969 but for the fact the Soviets were on their tail? I would contend not, right? So not all competition's bad, but you don't want to get across that lethal threshold, right? You don't want to go kinetic. So how do you avoid that? How do you put guardrails in to protect us from that, particularly with AI going ballistic? So organizing the chaos is really an interesting thing because we in the West have got this thing about black and white, peace, war, on, off, you know, grey zone ships, and then civilian ships, right? The war ships and then the non-war ships, right? The peace ships. But of course, we're being outplayed because that's not where the game is at anymore. It's in this grey zone. It's in this zone where so many other things are happening. And we need to actually recognise and adjust institutionally to the new paradigm. We in Australia don't have a Coast Guard, right? Why not? Actually, China's Coast Guard has been growing exponentially, and it's flummoxing us because it's being used in a way that you probably use a Navy, but it would then generate legal reactions that are about war. But a Coast Guard is a Coast Guard, right? What the hell is that? It's like, it's okay. It's just doing Coast Guard stuff, isn't it? Surely, right? Not. So then why should you listen to a pontificating professor from down under? Well, good question. It's a good, and the answer is, of course, that Australia isn't in the corner. The Mercator projection lies, right? It lies, damned lies, right? The equator is not 2/3 down the map, as this map would lead you to believe, right? Arguably, we should be right at the top in the middle, right? Of course. I'm joking, of course, but the point is that perception is reality, right? We think of ourselves as in a world that looks like the Mercator projection, and it's just leaving us astray, right? So the world is not that way, but Australia is a middle power with small power pretensions, I would argue. So the United States has Lewis and Clark. They go and find verdant valleys, rivers, lush rivers and great lakes. And, you know, there's the French explorers who did the same kind of thing further up north. We have Burke and Wills. And do you know what happens to Burke and Wills? They die in the desert. Bingo. Yes, thank you. So the point is that we're never going to be a great power. We're never going to host 300+ million people because you're going to die of thirst before you get there, right? You just can't do it. So we're always going to want to be a friend of the United States, but it's pretty darn challenging, right? More so for you guys than for us. But like you, we're facing issues with First Nations about the legality and the question of who we are and where we are and how we got here and what justification we have for being here. These are all questions that are dealt with. Our countries deal with them. We're dealing with a parallel universe, if you like. Australia, of course, in the middle is very, very sparsely populated, very few roads, very, very vulnerable roads that arguably get to the point that Andrew Carr, my colleague at ANU, made that arguably Australia is a bit like an archipelago, right? We're actually pretty all empty in the middle. There's very little there. And where we live is actually around the rim. And we mostly transit by air or by sea. Very few people do the road journeys, right? And of course, like Canada, we've got the periodic cable. So we actually have got scope for collaborating quite closely. Australia's got critical minerals up the wazoo like you do, and we actually should be speaking more. And of course, the Carney visit to Australia was all about reinforcing the prospects of collaboration in that space as well. But of course, Australia geographically is kind of, it's quite different to Canada. You guys are more like South Island, New Zealand, and a little bit like Tasmania, but the rest of Australia is more like Mexico and California and Florida than anything else. But I like to say we live in Australia. Jude and I live in central Italy, this part. Canberra is with the vineyards and the olive groves predominate. But when Americans look across to Asia, you see China, 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 right? It's like, really, there's more to the world than China. When you look at it from down under, and now this is a low E-power index, but I've added Canada and France to it because I don't think it makes sense to look at this world without Canada and France in the equation. And this is the other thing you guys forget. France is a Pacific power. There's a scope for collaboration avec la francophonie that is quite consequential for the overlap of our interests, Australian and Canadian interests. But when you look up north from Australia, you see a much more diffuse picture. Now, this isn't Morgenthau's 9 elements of power, but it's 8. And it's a pretty close approximation of power, right? Writ large. And in that space, the US is not outstripping China, okay? Now, for Australia, we've got these ties with the United States, the Alliance, the Free Trade Agreement, a trilateral AUKUS pact, the Quad with India and Japan. We're part of the Five Eyes with you guys, which I wrote about in my book, Revealing Secrets. A gratuitous plug for one of my books, ladies and gentlemen, apart from Strategic Cousins. And, of course, the critical minerals, which got a lot of overlap there. But when we think about the connections we have with the United States, they really go back to World War II. This is where we worked very closely with MacArthur, and we see the establishment of an industrial scale intelligence apparatus alongside the Americans, as well as with Canada. Who would have thunk it, hey? Who knew that Canada was integrally connected with Australia in fighting the intelligence war in the Pacific in World War II? Well, when you go to Canadian Forces Base Leitrim, the hallways are lined with photos of Canadians in Darwin. Who knew? Except you have to have a clearance, security clearance, to go inside and have a look, right? But anyway, it's very interesting. The connections are deep. They're not very well recognized, but they are profound, right? And Korea, Battle of Kapiong, we fought this. The 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Line Infantry, you guys know about. In our case, it was the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. We fought this together, and we won because we fought together, right? At a nearby, in the Imjin Valley, the Gloucestershire Regiment, around about the same time, operating on its own, got overwhelmed. There's strength in unity. It's a useful metaphor for the challenges of today. But as I talk about continuity and change in the Australian intelligence community, we have what we call now the National Intelligence Community, which has evolved over the years to look like this, with 10 agencies in red, with oversight and so on. But it's actually not that dissimilar to the Canadian one. This is from one of my students who pulled this together, Anastasia Kalagnati, who did this great work comparing the model of Canada with Australia. Enormous parallels between them. And of course, Australia's defence sites are particularly of relevance for any great power competition in this space. And we have enormous space facilities for launching and re-entry. This one, the Coonibba Test Range in South Australia, 5 times the size of White Sands in the United States. You guys have similar geographical benefits. So with our Australia-Canada relations, so we are economically, middle powers at best, right? You guys are bigger than us, 2.1 trillion, 2.8, we're 2.1. The US and China are way bigger. India's bigger too. I mean, look, it's really useful to have a think of this and how there are limits to our power, right? There are limits to our economic heft. It's useful to have a sober recognition of that. And we've got a recognition also of the Five Eyes being under stress. And you guys are feeling that stress more than us directly, but it's a palpable concern. And then there's the question, in Australia, we've long talked about Australia being the 51st state. And you guys have kind of made us a little bit miffed in a backhanded way by being named by the president of the US as the 51st state. So, I mean, it's an insult to you guys, but it's funny how Australians, it's taken the wind out of the sail of the anti-American critics in Australia who said, oh, we're just the 51st state. Get in line, Australia. Get in line. But of course, this collaboration between Australia and Canada goes back. You've got there our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, with Justin Trudeau. But earlier than that, Stephen Harper came to Australia when he started talking about strategic cousins, riffing off the title of my book, published by McGill Queen's University Press, merci beaucoup, a few years ago. And of course, reinforced by Mark Carney in his recent visit to Australia, when he talked about Australia and Canada as strategic cousins as well. And here's, I think they're onto something. They're really onto something. We have got a lot in common. We're geographically quite similar. We're also very closely aligned in terms of the cultural, the world, self-expression and survival, and this traditional versus secular value space. In that, you look at where Canada and Australia sit. Are there any two countries closer? It's extraordinary how close we are. And actually, you see the United States is actually some distance away using that cultural map as a guide. I like to use that. I used it in my PhD in the book Strategic Cousins more than 20 years ago, and it hasn't shifted. We're in the same space. But the other thing is, you guys don't tend to think of is you are a Pacific power as well, right? You are equidistant to the hotspots of Northeast Asia. We don't think about this very often, but you're as close to China as we are. It's that bloody Mercator projection, right? It lies. It doesn't tell the truth. This is what the world actually can look like when you spin it that way. So when we think about the rupture, the calling for values-based realism, as Mark Carney has done, what does that mean? What does it mean to take the sign out of the window? Well, Australia has been very circumspect about how it responds, and I wrote this piece a few days ago now with the strategic cousins, and I make the point that Australia is a middle power with small power pretensions, about working more closely with Canada would really help ensure we can be more confident, self-reliant, a regional leader stepping forward in a crisis when others are reluctant. And the upturned world, really, the rupture, if you like, is an opportunity to do just that. And this is where I think Canada and Australia have some things we can do. So we've got common security concerns, and of course we've got history. We've got so much history, which is what my book Strategic Cousins was all about, mapping out how much we have in common. Over the years, we've done so much together without really giving it too much thought. Canada and Australia have enormously overlapping interests and values that are really worth pursuing. And as we think about the future, closer collaboration, personnel and information exchanges, we have a lot of the kit that you guys are getting, or we've got a lot of reason to swap notes. You're buying our Gingerly operational radar network, operates from 3 sites across Australia. That is a masterful piece of technology. It's really super good. Gives you incredible ability to look beyond the horizon. In one of my previous incarnations, I had a degree of oversight of aspects of that in the intelligence space. Very cool technology. And of course, we're doing stuff with P8s, P3s, the AWACS, the frigates, and of course the fighters. So Australia's got a number of points of tension. I just drag on. We're an Anglo-European power sitting on the edge of Asia, right? So we're a middle power with small power pretensions. As I say, we've got a fear of abandonment and a fear of entrapment. So we're afraid the United States is going to leave, but we're also afraid the United States is going to drag us into a war in Taiwan. And we've got an alliance that is an 800-word essay that doesn't say very much. No headquarters, no commanding general, no forces assigned. Okay, so what is it? Not very much, right? But we have got this relationship that goes back 80 plus years, and there's this argument that Australia is an independent ally, that Shannon Tao argues, and then Coral Bell argues, no, we're a dependent ally. Actually, both theses are both true. You've got to look at them from different angles to see that. And I think there's a parallel there with Canada, strong parallel with the phenomena of Canada's sense of independence and dependence. We have this sense of defending forward or defending of Australia. Well, we go forward, World Wars I, II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and in behind that, between we go hide behind the moat. Not dissimilar to Canada. And for us, we're girt by sea, as Beck Strading and Joan Wallace pointed out. So for us, our environment is a bit different to yours, although your frozen sea to the north is arguably as contested, if not more so than ours. We lead when we need to, like we did in the East Timor crisis, when you guys came along with the Vandus, with the HMCS Protector and a Hercules aircraft. And we follow when we don't, like in Afghanistan and Iraq and Korea, where we worked closely with you guys, but also in Vietnam, where we also deployed. There's the gun versus gunner debate, butter debate, obviously. So what's next for us in the United States? Well, I'm saying we need to muscle up. Now, Mark Carney's already declared Canada's going to do that. I think Australia's got to do that as well. We've got a foreign policy white paper that talked about bolstering ties with every other regional partnership we've got. And Canada's in that mix. And Penny Wong, our foreign ministers, talked about a recalibration of our foreign policy recently in November. She talked about the region first, a web of relationships rather than standing alone, domestic resilience, and amplified middle power diplomacy. And guess who else is in that space? Canada, of course, our closest facsimile as a middle power, and our exercise of middle power diplomacy and middle power power across the full 9 elements of Morgenthau's idea of national power. For us, though, when we faced an existential crisis, it was here, in the archipelago to the north. So for us, that matters more than for you, clearly. Now, I won't dwell on this, but we feel we can reconcile economic and national security, as I wrote about in this piece in the East Asia Forum. It's possible to trade with China and deal with the United States. It's not an either-or equation, but it is getting more challenging. And we've just signed a free trade agreement with Europe. We are all into CPTPP, like with Canada. We've got a lot of commonality there in terms of our interests in trade. We're also doubled down on AUKUS, which I won't dwell on, but we're also pushing back on promising we're going to go to Taiwan. No one promises in advance you're going to go to Taiwan. And in what scenario? I mean, it's nonsensical. But I won't dwell on these points. But then, of course, there's the part of the Venn diagram I haven't dealt much on yet, looming environmental catastrophe. What could possibly go wrong? Well, there are so many things that could go wrong and that are already showing strong signs of going wrong. That we're seeing exacerbated trends, floods, fires, pandemics, let alone the human-made ones that are talked about here. Leading my colleague, former Chief of Defence Force, Chris Barry, to saying we need a climate-first foreign policy for Australia. Others saying we need to hide behind the moat. Others saying we need to become an echidna and just be spiky and ugly and not attractive. And others saying we need to just be a very good owl, very good eyesight, but trade and not argue. But I'm a believer in the idea that Ezra Klein talks about being able to do all of that and still be abundant. Right? And I'd say for us, we need to survive using menagerie. And every animal metaphor you can think of, I think we need a crocodile, a koala, a friendly koala, a mean crocodile, the wedge-tailed eagle that can fly and soar and see, along with beavers and sharks and Garuda birds from Indonesia, you name it, all the animals are friends and partners we can think of. And that's what I tried to write about in this paper, Adapting to Complexity, which is a free download from this website there, which I can share. But essentially what we're dealing with is very much the same as what you guys are dealing with. Great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. And it's for that reason I would encourage you and your students to think about a sabbatical or a stint dans le pays d'Australie.
Avec plaisir. Thank you very much, John. Very interesting. Please join me. Thank you, John, for this, I would say, very comprehensive tour de table, really. I'm not sure, I can't think of anything you missed out of that, except perhaps nuclear deterrence that I didn't see, but then we may want to dig into that in the question period. But what I get, one of the takeaway I have from your presentation is we have a clear sense of what our adversaries want, their intent, their capabilities, even the strategies they're implementing. You talk about development and things like that from Chinese point of view. And the Russians, it's pretty clear what they're doing, the way they're approaching their periphery. But the question mark in your presentation is all about the US. The uncertainty we have about their own understanding of their intent, of their strategies and capabilities we have a better sense of. And you highlight different points of views in your presentation, which leads to questions about, of course, is there a greater plan that we can't see, but we hope exists? but that may be more hope than, than thought. But the question I want to ask you is to dig into this a little bit deeper and trying to make sense of that perhaps changing or not so changing U.S. foreign policy. But most importantly, because if we want to deal with the consequences it may have with Canada and Australia, how enduring is the question of these transformations, or what we see as potentially transformation of U.S. foreign policy we're dealing with, which will lead to a different approach. Will you be more a koala or a porcupine? That depends of how you see U.S. intents, its strategies, and the enduring transformation if not of U.S. defense and foreign policy. So what's your views on this?
So it's a good question. It's a great question. And it speaks to the challenge the West and the rest have in re-establishing confidence in what the United States is going to do next. And this gets to their own internal angst about their economic prospects. They're being eclipsed by China technologically, their desire to impose tariffs, catastrophic tariffs, arguably. I'm not an economist, but, pundits assure me that these are really, and you think about the response in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, it's toxic. These tariffs are really counterproductive to American, I would have thought, American interests. Certainly perception of in Australia of America's, the utility of the relationship with the United States is its soft power, Joe Nye's soft power. But soft power doesn't seem to rate in this presidency. Now, the other aspect, of course, is the fact that this is the second time Donald Trump's been elected. So even with Donald Trump having no option to go to a third term, there is still a significant phenomenon in the US body politic that is enthused by the ideas that led to him being elected. So, there are pundits out there hoping for a kind of Obama-like Democrat-led renaissance after this, Republican dark patch in that, according to that interpretation of things. I think it's misconceived. The United States is becoming much more transactional, as I sort of said, Jacksonian, inward-looking, and not really concerned about the rest of the world. This echoes historical trends where we've seen in the United States had waves of introspection and externalities and willingness to accept immigration, and they're not. The 1920s, we see a drastic reduction in migration, the rules tightening up the prospects for immigrants coming to the United States or going to the United States. That seems to be echoed today, a real hardening on foreignness, on other, and a desire to, and at least certainly in a sufficiently large body of the American body politic to make the rest of us think twice about their enthusiasm for maintaining the international order which they helped establish. I make the point, the San Francisco Treaty for the UN, it's not the Moscow Treaty, it's the San Francisco Treaty, right? Signed in San Francisco because America, it's the UN headquarters in New York, not in Berlin or Tokyo or somewhere else. This is an American creation. A bit the current zeitgeist seems to be to kind of retreat from these institutions as if they're moribund, they're no longer working. We have to try something else like the Board of Peace, which is like,
we're waiting on the peace part of the board.
The peace bit, and interesting to see who's joined it. Where are the Europeans? Australia hasn't signed up. Japan hasn't signed up. Did Japan sign up? Japan is more calculating and kind of ruthless in its realpolitik sometimes, I would contend. So yeah, it's a problem. But I think we all, and Canada's feeling this arguably considerably more acutely than Australia. We all need to be hard-nosed about protecting our interests. Now, ironically, this is the great irony. The United States actually has been calling for us to look out for ourselves more. So for us to do it, ironically, is going to do what they've wanted us to do, right? If we're going to be more self-dependent, more self-reliant, that actually means being more capable and not reliant on the United States to do it for us. Arctic defense, collaboration with NATO partners, operating perhaps to a certain extent with partners in the Pacific, like Japan and Australia. That means you've got to have the frigates or the aircraft or the forces that can deploy and conduct activities with these partner nations. You've got to invest economically. You've got to invest scholarships. You've got to invest in, critical minerals deals. These are all things that were not on the table. They were not up for negotiation 10 years ago. So I would contend that the two Trump administrations and the Biden interregnum have, and the kind of the challenges that it presented as well, have left us with this sense of America as being different. It's not the old Uncle Sam of the Cold War. It's now a different beast.
Thanks. I'll open it to questions if you have any. Vincent?
Thank you very much. Vincent Rigby from the Maxwell School. Miguel and I had a chance to chat earlier today, but thank you for that. That was a great tour de force and covered a lot of material. Really interesting the way you characterized Australia as a middle power with small power pretensions. And I've often thought that Canada was a middle power with great power pretensions in a strange way, in the sense that we have been all things to all people. And when it came to our foreign policy, I've always thought we were a little bit all over the map. So we consider ourselves a European nation, member of NATO, strong European ties, et cetera, et cetera. We do consider ourselves an Indo-Pacific nation. We now have an Indo-Pacific strategy that's 3 or 4 years old. We like to play in Africa. Half our foreign development assistance is in Africa. We see ourselves as a Latin American and Caribbean nation as well, like to play in the Western Hemisphere. We can see ourselves as a Middle East country to a certain extent, although our resources there are pretty limited these days, but we like to harken back to the Suez crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been a little bit all over the map with very limited resources. And that has, I think, been our downfall in many respects in terms of a foreign policy that has been a little bit dispersed and not very focused. So I guess my question to you is, for a country that's now looking at diversifying its foreign policy, moving a little bit away from the United States, a danger that it's going to diversify even more and perhaps become even less focused. What would be your advice? You mentioned Australian foreign policy. We've not had a foreign policy statement in this country since 2005. So over 20 years. And I think a lot of people are waiting for Carney to come out and, take the Davos speech and all the other things that he's been saying and doing recently and put it into some kind of a coherent strategy. Much talk about a national security strategy or foreign policy. But what would be your advice based on the Australian experience to Prime Minister Carney in terms of formulating a foreign policy, given that you've just described a world that is completely upside down? Whether Trump becomes an historical footnote or not, it's a world that clearly is in chaos right now. How does Canada maneuver? What regions should it focus on? There's already been a lot of criticism that we've kind of saying goodbye to Africa. We're not paying that much attention to Latin America and the Caribbean anymore. Maybe that's a good thing. But would you have any advice in terms of geographical focus and also just in terms of how Canada can make a real difference on the world stage?
So that's a great question, Vince. Thank you. And great comments as well. One of the things that strikes me as an enduring obligation for Canada is defence of the North. And that's becoming hotter and hotter. That's becoming a really contentious issue, particularly as it's become quite adversarial over the Arctic territory, Arctic space, I should say. And there's that wonderful essay, was it Niels Orvik, on Defence Against Help. Mm-hmm. Wonderful essay, which to my mind, and I remember reading it when I was doing my PhD over 20 years ago, and it made to my mind, a compelling thesis for what Canada's defence was about, right? You do it so the Americans don't do it for you, right? If you don't, by implication, they probably will. And I would contend that over the last probably 15 years, that the capability for Canada to defend itself has atrophied to the point where that became a not unreasonable thing for Trump to formulate in his imagination and articulate to Justin Trudeau at Mar-a-Lago with this invitation to be a state. It's like, wow, right? That clearly has energized the Carney government to react and say, no, we're going to muscle up. We're going to cover our own territory. So that, to my mind, has to be number one. You have to do that well to get the Americans off your back. But in doing that well, you can offer as a side hustle, if you like, a great support to the rest of NATO. Incidentally, also great support to countries like Australia and New Zealand dealing with Antarctic issues, right? Because there's a strong parallel there between our two set of circumstances. There's enormous, I touched on this in the presentation, enormous great power competition over in Antarctica, much like there is over the Arctic. And many of the same players, Norway, the UK, the US, NATO partners, France, they're all there, right? These are 4 NATO players and a couple of NATO ring-ins like Australia and New Zealand. There's 6 of us, and there's Russia in there, and there's China, and of course the Latin Americans, Chile and Argentina. So it's big, right? And what happens if it melts? What happens if by the time our grandkids are coming to Ukraine, it's melted? Well, there's already plans afoot to drill, right? There's been a lot of exploration of oil and gas opportunities and mineral resources in Antarctica that once it becomes more feasible, and China plays the long game here. They are not just focused on one electoral cycle. They're playing the long game. They got 5 bases down there. They're building a runway. They're going a 6th base coming up. The rest of us are all watching on and saying, oh, this is purely for scientific purposes. Nothing to worry about, surely, right? So anyway, so I think that's where that focus, it makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, remembering that Mercator lies, the world is round. And if at the Arctic, you're actually on the edge of, you're in the NATO space anyway. So you've got a lot you can do with the northern NATO countries there that are right there and that have an interest in collaborating closely with Canada. So Canada can actually reinvent itself as the new kind of northern leader and inadvertently provide a great kind of mentoring role for leading in the South.
Interesting. Thanks. Thank you. What?
Thank you very much for your presentation. So I had a question more about the theory you used, the concept of polycrisis. So it have been developed by thinkers like Edgar Morin, Adam Tooze, more earlier. I even saw this week. I even saw that scholars like Thomas Homer Dixon and James Woods wanted to have tried to formalize the polycrisis as a research agenda.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do that too.
Exactly. So I wanted to ask you, how does your work relate to these approaches, and do you see polycrisis as a useful analytical framework or more of a descriptive concept? Because there's a risk of becoming a catch-all concept also. So I wanted to maybe.
It's a great point. So this is why I've come up with the Venn diagram, because what I'm proposing is that we look to kind of corral, if I can use that word, corral scholarship in the opponents of the Venn diagram. People dealing with environmental issues, people dealing with corruption and governance issues and terrorism and civil war and human condition, and then people dealing with great power competition, and then people dealing with the technology. My sense is what we need to do is actually, there's great scholarship in all of those domains already, but they're not encouraged to actually pull it together. And that the dark space in the middle of the Venn diagram is where I think there's some innovation in scholarship that's waiting to be grasped, and I'm attempting to articulate a way of grasping it. So that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah. So get scholarship, and in fact, I've got a proposal in at the moment for a research grant to hire scholars on each of the fields, and then work on a mechanism to weave them together to distill a greater meaning, a greater consequence that can have policy implications for our governments that will hopefully rise above the petty politics of the parliamentary system we operate in, so that we can get buy-in from across the political spectrum. You get consensus on the urgency, because as you know, there's all sorts of conspiracies out there about environmental, the gravity of environmental risk, right? And I think we need to grapple with them. We need to not just denounce them, but actually think about what's unpack that. How did that get to be? And what part of the AI bit is involved? What part of the conspiracy theories? What part of foreign interference is involved? Because there is some evidence of considerable foreign interference in some of these spaces. And the echo chamber phenomenon. Unpack that and then kind of reconstitute it. That's what I'm trying to do. And I'm trying to use that model by Anthea Roberts to do it. Using her scholarship, my version of the polycrisis, merging that together to come up with something that will actually help, hopefully, revalidate the ivory tower, academia. Because academia has been under assault from governments. I'm sure it's been the case here too. In Australia, academia has been pilloried for a whole host of reasons, and the United States, it's catastrophic, right? The government funding has been stripped. There's a need for a renaissance of academia, and I think this is something where we can actually make that happen. You got a follow-on question?
Yeah,
we have to leave the.
So that can the classical theories you mentioned be used with this tool, or is that how you see it?
The idea. Yeah, I have yet to do it. I've put up a model. I want to test it. So that's my plan. I've put in a grant application to test this model to try and make it work.
So for Australia's foreign policy, or for
Australia?
Yeah, we want to work on the other cousin.
But with implications for cousins.
All right,
Yeah.
good. Look forward to the sequel of your thesis. Thank you very much, John. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Thanks all for joining us online and in person to this event. It has been recorded, and we'll put it online on the Réseau d'analyse stratégique in the coming days. Thank you very much. Merci à vous. Bonne journée. Au revoir.